Hello, everyone. So, today we are going to get into the women and family in Europe in the 19th century, primarily focusing on women, but also getting into some of the changes in family life and things like that of this particular time period. And basically, what we're going to talk a lot about is what was known as the woman question, is that this was the debate over the role of women in society. And so, what I'm going to be getting into is kind of showing you what expectations were, what some changes were. We're not going to get full blown women's movement yet. That's not quite there, although we'll have some individuals that help to get some change that comes about. But women's rights movement specifically will be coming a little bit later. So one of the places where women were really starting to, I, I guess you could say, express themselves, if you will, would be in the workplace. Now, early on, especially in the earlier part of the Industrial Revolution, many areas just wouldn't employ women. And the argument was that this would, quote unquote, negatively impact families, which is an excuse that still kind of goes around today. The idea if that women aren't home, the family kind of falls apart. But in 1870, or after 1870, with the kind of second wave of the Industrial Revolution, women are going to basically fill a need that businesses have. No longer can they just get by with only male workers, okay? The demands are too high. So, for instance, in large factories, many women get service jobs there, or they will work for the federal government or some banks. Specifically, they'll be like clerks and typists, secretaries, they'll work in sales or filing. There'll be government phone operators. In small businesses, they can also, again, specifically help with administration, if you will. Again, the filing and organization, and sometimes working as a salesperson, like in a small clothing store or something like that. In education, you will see women will be pretty much involved as elementary school teachers, as well as sometimes maybe get into high school teachers, but for the most part, it's just elementary school teachers. And also in the growing health industries, you will see women having more opportunities in positions that are like nursing, and not just like battlefield nursing, kind of like I mentioned before, but like nurses in hospitals and schools and places like that. And what's important to understand here is that as women are getting more employment opportunities, those are places in which they can fight for equality a little bit better. Whereas prior to this point, if women really, if they don't have jobs, if they're not involved in economics, it becomes really hard for them to show how they should be equal or should get these equal opportunities. Again, remember, because of the focus on economics at this time. Now, what does this work actually lead to? Well, for many women, what it's going to do is actually lead to opportunities for living on their own. Now, the focus is going to be on marriage, and that is going to be, of course, the driving expectation. However, when you live on your own, it just gives you a chance to express yourself and to show your independence. In a lot of ways, that's like kind of the first step. Women having control over their own money, women having control really of their own lives, and not having to answer to a man, if you will, in their life. And that was really, really important for many women. But for the most part, early on, there is a ceiling of the level of education that they can get. Again, even though I talked about a lot of jobs, there are still very few jobs in some cases that they have opportunities to get into. And so that can make it harder for women to kind of break through because of their inability to get those types of jobs. But excuse me, but what we're really looking at is women trying to get out and live on their own. But the tough part of being a woman on their own is if you don't have a good income or a good job, it becomes a big challenge. And that's where the issue of prostitution comes in at. Now, the reason I talk about this is not all that women were prostitutes and not to talk about as prostitutes as bad, but we need to understand that this became a challenge for a lot of women. Many women lacked income or they had unstable income. And as a result, there weren't a lot of other options. And so many women end up going into prostitution. And we're talking about, tens of thousands of women by the late 1800s. I mean, there were thought to be 60,000 in just London by itself. And for many women, it was a temporary thing to maybe try to do this and get some money and then get a real job. And the fact of the matter is, most of the women that are doing it because they have no other choice to get money to eat. And that's a challenge. Now, believe it or not, for most countries, it was actually legal and regulated by the government. And in some cases, you actually had to have a license to do it. But the societal view, these women were looked down upon. They were looked at the lowest of the low. And, if that was your profession at the time, it was just really, really hard. And what else you had here, though, is what people weren't really conceptualizing was how easy it was for prostitutes to be hurt or to be attacked in a variety of different areas. There was no protection of it. It was regulated, and these women were expected to pay taxes and stuff like that, but there was no one that was there to protect them. And this is a very risky type of job. We see sexual and other type of abuses perpetrated against prostitutes even today. And probably what really brought the plight of a lot of prostitutes to light was the Jack the Ripper episodes in London in the late 1800s. In the Whitechapel section of London, 5 prostitutes were brutally murdered. The person was never found. But even the press started to get behind. Are the lives of women just so fleeting that we can allow this to happen, or do we not really care? And so it had a lot of an impact. So Britain also, but then you also have discrimination against them. And the biggest example of that was the Contagious Diseases Act, which actually made it illegal to arrest prostitutes and examine them for venereal diseases. They could actually, if they have venereal diseases, they often could be forced into jail and into hospitals to get instruction on morals from people, except that no law existed for men. You would only do this to women. And probably a woman that an unsung hero in trying to help prostitutes was a social reformer. On the bottom right there, you see Josephine Butler really worked very hard to try to find housing for people and try to help women get back on their feet. And she actually led the charge to get that law in Britain repealed. But you can see, this is just another example of how women could be discriminated upon that men would not have to deal with. Now, one way that women were trying to make a change was in education. Okay, and first and foremost, again, it's getting jobs in education, as I already mentioned. For instance, just over in the United States, 2/3 of all teachers were women. Many people felt that this was naturally their position as a woman. It was just kind of an outreach of childcare, but, the value of education was growing and growing, and this gave women an opportunity to obviously contribute to society, to show their worth, which again is an important stepping stone for overall equality. And you also start to see colleges open up so women can get deeper levels of education, and that's really important. Queen's College opens up in England. The other big one here is Bedford College. That's a picture of it on the right, was opened up for women in London in 1849, and this actually provided education so that older single women, who were often referred to as spinsters, not particularly nice, to get educated, to get a job, and that was really, really important. Okay, and one woman that even took it to the next level is this woman Barbara Bodicon, who was from Britain, and she actually opened up a school for women to teach them economic independence, domesticity as well, but more along the lines of how to take care of yourself and to cook and clean and that, so you can actually live a regular life on your own. But in general, it is still very difficult for women to get in universities. All the main universities are for men only. But again, it's a foot in the door, and women are starting to try to give themselves more opportunity. As I said, some more women are living on their own. So you've got some good stuff going on. Now, the biggest demand, though, for women was marriage. And at this time, particularly in Europe, this was a basic demand for women. And the whole idea was like domesticity was really like glorified, that this was like the thing to do, and that it was great and fantastic for women to be at home and cooking and cleaning, and it was portrayed as like kind of like an ultimate goal. The bigger issue for women was that most women living on their own, really it was too hard because their wages, even if they could get jobs, were so low that it was very, very difficult to survive on your own. Also, you had issues for women. Many women, when they were older, might join convents, so that they could be provided for, but the number of convents was dropping at this time. So that makes it harder. And really, if you're an unmarried woman or a widow, it is really, really challenging just to get by. And not surprisingly, as a result, you actually see marriage numbers go up at this point. Or if women can't get married later on in life, they might take a job as a live-in servant, which was a big thing starting for the middle classes, starting to have maids and things like that now, because that showed how they were economically prosperous. And so we do see marriages go up. And again, don't get me wrong, if people want to get married, people should get married, and that's important. But for women, it was an expectation. It was very difficult to survive without it, whereas men, it was still an expectation, but they could survive without it. We're also going to see women start to address birth rates and birth control. In the late 1800s, we're going to see birth rates drop, and a lot of it has to do with new birth control methods. Things like condoms and diaphragms start to be made for the first time, and they are made out of vulcanized rubber, and this, of course, makes them actually very and much more effective, although they don't get really big until the early 1900s. We do see a possible increase in abortion at this time, which was actually illegal, but it still existed. And mainly it was to keep family size down, and families are starting to have less and less children because they can't afford to have them. And then what you end up having is a woman on the right by the name of Aletta Jacobs opens up the first birth control clinic in Europe. And also it's to help women who have children as well. So it's, I guess you'd say it's like your first women's clinic. So it can talk to women about childcare, and they have midwives and stuff there, as well as possible birth control options, so family sizes can be kept down. And this was a big change, and Aletta Jacobs was pretty important because of that. Now, let's focus on the biggest deal at this time, really was the family unit. And really it's the family unit in the Middle East, not the Middle East, I'm sorry, in the middle class Middle East, that's funny. In the middle class, that is really, really kind of the core of everything, because this is the largest number of people. Now, the paradigm is traditionally this, okay? The mother, if she ends up working a little bit, but by the time she gets married, she needs to be at home taking care of children, and the husband works. And as a result, that's how everything can go. But what you also have is that because these people are making more money, as I've mentioned in a couple of my other videos, they then have opportunities to do things together and go out and celebrate new holidays. And so everything really becomes focused on the family at this time. And a lot of this was a thing really pushed forth in Victorian England, and it would spread throughout the continents, of the togetherness of families. Is that, for instance, that Christmas becomes a holiday in which families need to get together, and you have the Christmas tree and Yule log. For instance, over in the United States at this time, like picnics and the celebration of the 4th of July as families becomes a big thing in the 1950s, and that you're doing things as a community, and everything is being done together, and that's the whole idea here. Now, you also have new demands and expectations for women. Women are now expected to learn how to sing and play piano, because family interaction is basically all on the responsibility of women. They are supposed to organize it, and then there's supposed to be this idea of, I'm going to say, like, the hostess. Okay. So, having these parties that are expensive. Now, this here is a bit of an upper class one, but if you take away like the tuxedos and the fancy silverware, you're still expected to do this in middle class houses. And, women should cook and clean and then entertain people, and all of it is falling on the women. And basically, again, all of society revolving around interacting as couples with children and stuff. And as a result, child rearing becomes a big thing, okay? And there's some new ideas and demands. One, that children must actually be protected. We're not trying to throw them into work at age 9, although lower class or poor children often would have to work more often than anybody in the middle or the upper class. But the idea here is that children should enjoy childhood and it should last as long as you can. Children should interact with each other, like these idea of modern day play dates, and new games. We have dolls and games. Dolls were around before, but games like checkers and chess and things like a maypole, or today we call that like tetherball. Like all of these types of things, plus like the regular sports that I talked about that boys were kind of expected to do, this became like a big thing. And so for boys, the idea was to raise them to be as manly as possible. And as a result, they needed special education that was separate from girls. Sports and teamwork were a big activity, and boys were basically raised with the idea that they have to be tough, they have to be disciplined, they have to discipline children, and be providers, because that's what they're expected to do. In order to advance that in England, you actually have the founding of the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts was created, that it was in 1908 in Britain, and it was big on recreational activities. But in these recreational activities, the Boy Scouts would learn skills through earning badges. It would be big about patriotism, self-sacrifice, and masculinity. A great line from there is that the real Boy Scout is not a sissy. He adores his mother, but is not attached or hitched to her apron strings. So this idea of loyalty to your family, but working hard and being a manly man. Girls, on the other hand, not quite the same. There weren't as many opportunities. Sometimes girls would have clubs. Eventually, the Girl Scouts are actually founded. But the focus, again, for them is to give them skills like painting. And, they'll do reading and writing. But most of the education is focused on elementary school through maybe the equivalent of what we have in high school. If women went to college, it was more or less to find a husband. They would be taught, as you see there, to like paint and things like that, and to do things that would still make them more attractive to gaining a husband. Okay. Yeah, that's just how that's going to work. Wives, on the expectation, they're expected to be nurturing, and the house must always be in perfect order. And on the outside, they're supposed to make it like the picture on the top right. As you see there, those are two women playing chess, and everything seems to be perfect, and it's leisurely, and life is wonderful, and everything's relaxed. And you have this image of just everything's great, and you don't talk about problems or hardship. The truth is that you're constantly doing something, okay? You're constantly cleaning, you're taking care of children, you're picking them up or getting them from school. It is intense, okay? You're basically a CEO doing the work of every single thing. Okay, so the next time you want to think that a quote-unquote housewife doesn't do much, you need to wake up, because they do remarkable amounts of things. Unfortunately, you had to pretend like you didn't, which really made it very difficult for women. And we'll talk about that in class. Now, for the middle-class family in general, though, there were some things with them and with the working class that often kind of went uncovered. Yes, on the right, you kind of have the more wealthy, but on the left, this is kind of what we're looking at. You see that the clothing is nice, but it's not as fancy, say, as the stuff on the right. The boys have something, but but it's not like a really, really formal suit. Money in the end is crucial here, guys, and Girls were expected to find some type of work until they were married and actually give all that job money to the family. And that was all the way through guys like the 20s and 30s and 40s. I know my grandmom used to say that, when she first got her first job, like most of her money went to her dad. So, that gives you an idea. After marriage, they're expected to women could do some piecework at home. Children would sometimes in working classes find a type of job around age 10 if they couldn't continue their education. But with rising wages, this will slowly go down over time. But overall, we see a dynamic that would become the key paradigm of how things would go for a long time. However, with more women working, with more women getting education and being literate and seeing these things, this is when you're going to get the movement for the right to vote and equal political rights and economic rights, and that is going to start to grow. So even though we kind of have the situation in which women are trapped, if you will, or women don't have as many opportunities, you're getting the basis for this women movement that's going to hit in the late 1800s and roll right into the 1900s. All right, make sure you guys get any notes and stuff like that, and we will be talking soon.